Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cave of the Apologetics. I am Patrick,
And I'm Tony.
and we're winding down. Unlike a certain watchmaker of the universe who's not winding down, we're coming down towards the end of our book, A Scientism and Secularism, Learning to Respond to a Dangerous Ideology by J.P. Moreland. And hopefully by now, the people in the comments have realized that when we say scientism, we aren't talking about science, but scientism is the fact that there are a certain number of people that hold that all, or at least almost all, knowledge is gained through the natural sciences. And we're kind of on the backswing of we've presented the idea, we've talked about what makes it a dangerous ideology, we talked about how it's a self-defeating argument, we've talked about a number of ideas that are brought up that it is that type of scientism struggles to explain, things like the consciousness being a main one. And now we're getting more into the kind of positive case for the other side. Well, okay, if scientism isn't the thing, that if naturalistic science isn't the be all end all of explanation of providing us truth, are there other avenues, other areas of life that not only does it not fulfill for a good argument, but actually there's a competing worldview that comes and makes a different argument. So that's
And
where
we should note that scientism is a philosophical position, not a scientific position.
even though it doesn't want to be.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And that was one of the cases that Moreland made, that even though that it wants to present a scientific science-based point of view, the fact that it's making arguments puts it in the philosophical camp, which again is that whole self-defeating part. And so we continue on with chapter 12 here, and again we look at 5 different things that science cannot in principle explain. Now, it
Wow.
could have certain theories or anything like that. And the 5 cases that he makes here, I think he does a pretty excellent job of kind of picking the 5 things that keeps it in the scientific realm, but also shows kind of where the naturalistic science cannot tread. And that's not to poo-poo against the natural science. That has its place, but this is areas where that it cannot go. And so a lot of the subjects that he brings up here will be interesting to look at because they tend to be thought of maybe in the realm of science, but he makes the case that actually theism, in general theism, the belief in God, the idea of God, that God has made the world a God in a certain capacity, provides a better theory
Yeah.
to how it came
Explanation.
about.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, we can quabble over, well, then what God? That's not the type of question that's being asked here. The type of comparison made is between naturalism and general theism. And so, of course, we're going to present the case that the Christian God is the best explanation for that. But we'll probably go more of an internal critique from there, and we'll see what he does here. But for the most part, we're just kind of comparing as little factors as possible between the two. One presents its case from a naturalistic, no creator point of view, and the other one presents it as a entirely intelligent design aspect to it. So that's where we're at in chapter 12 here. And he starts out by saying the heart of scientism is the conviction that science can explain virtually everything. If there is not a valid scientific explanation for an event or state, then that is not properly an object of our knowledge. In reality, though, there are many things that science can't explain. And the problem is not that we lack sufficient data. The problem is that the sorts of thing that science cannot explain, there are those things they can't even explain, even in principle. So moreover, these things are items that we know to be true. But what makes all of this especially interesting is that theism actually can explain them. Theism isn't confined by only the naturalistic things. It can bring in other factors that presents a more coherent, better accounting for the case of why these things are. And so he says, let's look at these 5 different things that theism can explain, but science cannot.
Right. Okay. And so he begins. So what he's going to do here in this particular section is 2 things. He's gonna in this section, on this first section, is called Science Cannot Explain the Origin of the Universe, right? And the first thing he's going to do is examine a particular argument for the existence of God, the cosmological argument, and show how that explains the origin of the universe. And then he's going to move into why science can't explain the origin of the universe. So he says, it is now beyond reasonable doubt that the universe, a system of time, space, and matter, non-personal energy, right, began to exist at some finite time ago, right? So he's suggesting that's beyond reasonable doubt that the universe began to exist. And so he tells us that the cosmological argument, a powerful argument for this fact from God, for God's existence, was formulated many centuries ago, but it has received renewed interest in the last few decades. And he gives us a version. I think this is probably his version of it. There are a couple of versions of it. This is a little bit different version of the Kalam-Khalazma argument than we see in somebody like William Lane Craig. It's
Right.
similar, but not exactly the same.
Correct.
So Craig's argument goes something like this: whatever begins to exist had a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe had a cause. That's kind of Craig's angle on the Kalam-Khalazma argument. His particular presentation of it, he starts off with these two premises. The universe had a beginning. The beginning of the universe was caused. The cause of the beginning of the universe was personal. So that's how he frames the cosmological argument.
Right, exactly. So the philosophical evidence that the universe had a beginning, he moves on by saying, as we saw in an early chapter, one philosophical argument for premise 1 involves the impossibility of crossing an actual infinite number of events. And again, this is one that you kind of have to use your brain power to picture, because what is an actual series of events? And there's someone like Craig who likes the hotel model and talking about moving up a room and an infinite number of rooms. But in order to do that, you have to go back an infinite number of rooms in order to move. And so you could never move rooms because you're always traversing an infinite number of rooms to get to the next one. And so
I think he calls it the Hilbert's Hotel or
yeah,
something like that, where if you have a full it's an infinite number of rooms in a hotel, and every room is full, but there's an infinite number of rooms. And so someone comes in and wants another room, and the proprietor doesn't say it's full. He says sure, and he shifts everybody one room over because it's an infinite number, and now you have a room open, and that person can fill that room. But there's no addition to the people to the rooms because
right.
it's still infinite, right? Which is kind of deal, right? That's what he gets at.
Right. So, in order for us to get here at this time, again, your here is different than my here, and that's a different problem. We'd have to cross an infinite amount of time. Well, okay, just keep waiting forever and you'll finally get here. Well, we're here, which means that we didn't cross an infinite number of forevers. And so that means that here, because we're here, time isn't actually infinite. And so this impossibility of crossing an actual infinite is just not possible. So you can have the math work out, and we can talk about infinite there, but it's more of a general concept for our math to work out than finding them within the scope of the real universe here. So an actual infinite is a collection of things that is infinitely larger than any finite number. So there's our definition. If the universe had no beginning, the number of events crossed to reach the present moment would be, again, actually infinite. And so because we're here, we know we didn't cross an actual infinite because we'd still be going in order to get here. So therefore, not only does that tell us the universe has a beginning, but I think that also tells us the universe actually has an end. So there's an interesting take to that as well. As maybe we're okay with knowing the beginning of the universe, but I think we're all maybe a little bit more trepidatious about the end of it all.
Right. So that's his first argument. That's his philosophical argument that shows that the universe had a beginning, right? Because you can't have an actual infinite number of events. Then he moves to what he calls his scientific evidence that the universe had a beginning. So we just saw his philosophical argument, now his scientific evidence. And he tells us that while there are two scientific arguments that the universe had a beginning, in his view, the philosophical argument is stronger than either of the scientific arguments, and he believes it establishes a beginning without needing further support. And so while science, he tells us, can provide evidence that the universe had a beginning, it cannot say what caused the beginning, right? And so one scientific argument for premise 1, which again says that the universe had a beginning, derives from the second law of thermodynamics. All right, which is in one form states that the amount of useful energy in the universe is irreversibly being used up. Right? That's the basic idea, at least, kind of a version of it. And so if the universe were infinitely old, it would have already used up all its useful energy. which is kind of an interesting kind of twist, right?
Right.
So, the universe is running down, all the energy is being used up. So if it was infinite, all the energy would have been used up. It's not used up, and therefore it hasn't been around for an infinite time period. All right, that's the basic idea.
Right. And even if you wanted to have an outside force put in a energy within to our universe, well, then you're getting to a supernatural, literally a supernatural
Beyond
event.
natural, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And then again, that's something that purely naturalistic science doesn't want to do. And so we can't even allow that to happen. So, the idea of things like the second one that he brings up here, the argument for the classical Big Bang theory, currently the most reasonable and widely respected theory regarding the origin of the universe. Again, just taking the premise of this is what most people consider kind of the start of it all. He says, okay, we might have qualms with it, but he's going to kind of take it and assume it as fact here. Well, the Big Bang model theory, it confirms the fact that space-time physical universe had a beginning. The scientists have discovered evidence that galaxies are accelerating away from each other. If you were to reverse time and extrapolate backwards, you'd reach a point in space and time and matter which would spring to existence at the initial creation event. And in the book, he talks about kind of putting a spot on a balloon and blowing it up. And so there you're having that dot go away from other parts of the dot, and you're seeing expand. And so you can only go back to a certain point when the balloon is blown up, but it was at that point that the balloon was blown up and the dot was made to expand. And so it doesn't do any good to go before that. So we know at some point the universe that is our dot on the balloon has been made and then blown up and expanded. We talk about this when it's covered with redshift radiation, and that took out the solid state model quite a bit and was supplanted with the Big Bang model as well.
All right, so there's his second scientific argument, he tells us, right? The classical Big Bang theory that shows that the universe had a beginning. All right, so those are his two. So he's given us a philosophical argument for premise one and the impossibility of an actual infinite series of things, and then two kind of scientific arguments, right? The second law of thermodynamics and the classical Big Bang theory. All right, well, what about premise two, right? The beginning of the universe was caused. And he says this is confirmed by universal experience with no clear counterexamples. Alleged cases, he tells us, from science where something comes from nothing actually involves one thing coming into existence from something else, right? Lead from uranium, for instance, right? And so even though, here's this case where something came from nothing. Well, no, actually something came into existence from something else, right. What science always measures, right? And so he tells us that this premise is also confirmed philosophically by analyzing the nature of nothingness, right? So nothingness, he says, is a total, complete lack of any being whatever. No properties, events, causal powers, etc. No real thing, he tells us, can just pop into existence from nothing, right?
Right.
And so that is he's suggesting that is evidence that the beginning of the universe was caused. That's right. His premise too.
And this is something that happens, is known and put forth. You have Lawrence Krauss, who wrote the book on nothingness and expect you to pay $30 for the hardcover of nothing. And then when you open it, you realize what he means by nothing is actually something. So, you have this vacuum and all of a sudden these particles just appear out of nowhere and they exist for a short period of time. So here you have a thing launching into existence. Now we think they come from somewhere. Oh, hold on. They come from somewhere, but all right, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. But they pop into existence from nowhere in a vacuum, and so therefore it comes from nothing.
Yeah.
Well, except it pops into existence into somewhere, and so you have to have a nothing first. And so again, this is and this is confirmed over and over again. I watched Piers Morgan grill, I think, Neil deGrasse Tyson on it, and he too brought forth this case of Krauss talking about nothing, and Neil deGrasse Tyson is saying, listen, when he means nothing, he doesn't mean nothing. He means kind of something, but in a scientific way, nothing. Well, a scientific way is not the way that anyone means it in any.
And it's not the philosophical way, right?
Exactly.
It's the philosophical nothing, and that's what he's getting at here, right? Philosophically, nothing means nothing, right?
Right.
Yeah. One criticism is like, watch me pop a fist into existence out of nothing. There it is. Came into existence out of nothing. Well, no, there was no fist there, but there was something there,
Right.
right? So that's the basic idea.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
usually our making fun of people is against philosophers who have a lot of words to say nothing. But here, scientists are saying nothing with something and trying to get you to swallow nothing, which is something. So hopefully, again, you come here for the base assumption or the base explanation for things. So we have to explain to you the nothing that is something. So
Yeah.
the hard part is
Wow.
actually explaining nothing as nothing. So that's the hard part. He moves on to his premise 3, evidence that the cause of the beginning of the universe was personal. And so here's the kind of the kicker. Here's the one that you're probably most likely going to disagree with if you're not on the theist side. And so again, evidence 3 for the evidence for premise 3 he gives that the cause of the universe was personal derives from the fact that the ultimate laws of nature, time, space, and matter did not exist earlier than the beginning of the universe. Okay. Well, that causes that are physical and are subject to scientific law presuppose time, space, matter to exist. But since we are asking what caused time, space, matter, the cause itself must be something other than each of these things. Okay. So it can't be time. So just continue on. It has to come about, right? So it doesn't just wait 30 seconds and then time will start. Well, okay, how do I wait 30 seconds before time comes about? Space has to be there. Well, the universe is ever expanding. Well, what is it expanding into? What did it expand from? Well, it's expanded from nothing. Okay, well, then how did it start? Well, it came from nothing, but again, you have something, so there's that. And then matter, for all the things that are in the universe to exist, all the elements that you learned on your elemental table, those all sprung from nothing, but you need those things in order to make everything else. So you just give me nothing and I'll give you everything. And so there you go. That's the traditionally held classical model of the creation of the universe. Again, nothing is there for no period of time, and then all of a sudden it exploded and we get everything. So that's the contention that you have to argue from if you're not a personal creation point of view there. Well, the universe's immaterial cause had to be then timeless, spaceless, and had power spontaneously to bring the world into existence as the first mover. Such a cause must have genuinely free will, and since only persons have free will, it must be a personal creator. Right? So could it not have been the case? Well, yes, the creation of the universe could not have been the case. It isn't a contingent thing. And so therefore you have to have the will to do it. And in order for something to have the will to do that, it has to be a person.
Right. And so what he's trying to get at here is that theism, to a certain extent, explains, the origin of the universe. And he's using this cosmological argument to do that. Well, what about science? Can it explain the origin of the universe? And this is his main issue here. No, it cannot, right? And so he gives us 3 reasons science cannot, in principle, explain the origin of the universe. And we've kind of hinted at these already, right? So first, science explains one aspect of the universe, notice, by appealing to another aspect of the universe, right? And often by connecting the two, one aspect to the other aspect, by subsuming them under a law of nature. So you have this thing and you have this thing, and they're connected by some law of nature. And so he says scientific explanations presuppose then that the universe has to exist in order for those explanations to be employed in the first place. So you have to assume that something is there already in order to make a scientific explanation, is what he's suggesting here. And thus a scientific explanation cannot be used to explain the very thing, the universe, that must exist before scientific explanation can even get off the ground.
Right. Well, second, the scientific explanations apply to ongoing temporal states and changes of states. Both are events of various things according to relevant laws. And so scientific explanations presuppose time. Events are temporal episodes, and so no sense can be given to the idea of a timeless event and the reality of events. So again, think about playing pool, right? There was a time before the 8-ball was in the pocket. Well, what was that time? Well, it was on the table. And there was a time before that where they were all commingled together with the other solids and the other stripes. And then all of a sudden the cue ball hit it. Well, what was there before the cue ball? Well, there was the stick. And then, so you keep going back and back to all these events. What was the effect? Well, the effect was the breaking of the triangle of balls. And that was done through the cue ball. And before that, it was the power put into the to the stick. And before that, it was the food that the person consumed in order to have it. And so all these things are cause and effects. Well, you can't appeal to one without appealing to another. And so you have to have this initial first cause, or again, you have this actual infinite event that you need to appeal to. So we know that's not the case philosophically. And so there's no this timeless event thing that you can apply to and say, well, the universe just always is. It's always been expanding and contracting, heat, death. But how do you have an explosion when all of it's used up and the heat death of the universe happens? Well, you need to put more energy into it again. So again, even from the scientific claims of these things that they say, no, this is going to be the case. We have to worry about it in 30 billion years of the heat death of the universe, or however long it is. Once you appeal to it, you go, oh, no, that's not the case. And so I think later on in the chapter, he talks about this changing cab fallacy, which I really like. So they hold on to it until you bring up a portion of it that would speak against their position, and then you drop it and say, no, that's not what we mean. Or
let me out of the cab.
Exactly. Well, okay, from here, two things follow from this. For one, science will never be able to explain the first event, the beginning of the universe. Again, that's not to knock science, but it's to say that science can't do this, and so we don't ask the fish to climb up the tree. Because to do so, it would have to appeal to a prior event and a law connecting them. And it can't do that, so it can't. It's impossible for science to do that. But in this case, the origin of the universe would no longer be the first event. The prior explanatory event would be. But then to explain the first event, one would need to postulate another prior event, and a vigorous regress would happen. We don't have that. Again, the actual infinite, not possible philosophically, and so science cannot explain it. So what can explain it? Well, let me tell you about this guy in a book, and he wants you to know him.
Yeah. He says, for another thing, since scientific explanation ties one event to another via a law, such explanations presuppose, notice, time for those laws to be applicable. And thus, again, science cannot explain the origin of the very thing, time, that must exist before scientific explanations can be proffered in the first place. Right? So again, it doesn't explain time in terms of these events happening. And so that's his second hit on this. Thirdly, then he says, coming into existence, he tells us, is not a process, but an instantaneous occurrence, right? And so something either does or does not exist, period, he tells us. And so it follows that apart from the creative activity of God, there can be, in principle, no reason, no explanation for why one thing, say the universe, popped into existence as opposed to another thing. Science can only be applied to transitions of one thing into another. But coming into existence is not a transition.
Right.
And so science, he tells us, cannot in principle explain the coming into existence of the universe from nothing.
Yeah, if we just added that last electron to the bucket that was everything in the universe, then all of a sudden it pops into the universe. No, that's not the case. So, all right, moving on to the second one is that science cannot explain the origin of fundamental laws of nature. And he says that not all laws of nature are equally fundamental. Some can be derived from others. However, such derivations cannot continue indefinitely. There must be, and it's widely agreed that there are, fundamental or foundational laws of nature. But the existence and precise nature of these laws cannot be explained by science, since all scientific explanations presuppose them. We kind of talked a little bit about that in previous chapters as well. As far as a scientific explanation is concerned, these foundational laws are simply brute givens to be used to explain other things scientifically, but which themselves cannot be explained scientifically. So where do they come from? Why are they there? It's good to be able to know them to do science, but talking about the origin of these fundamental laws is just not there. It's just not in the confines of what science can do.
Yeah.
All right, and so that's 2 down of the 5, and so because I like to jibber jabber a lot more and talk about the cue balls and pool, even though I don't play myself, we'll come back next time and do the other 3 of the 5 things that science cannot explain, and that way it will give people in the comment section to criticize all the things that we didn't say, even though at the beginning of this I said we probably wouldn't say all the things that they wanted to say. So join us next time for the rest of this chapter of chapter 12. And as always, you can check us out on givethecross.com, YouTube, and all the other places that you'll find us. And so those are linked at caveofthecross.com as well, including all our other books. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.